Coming up on Network Africa. West Africa's regional bloc ECOWAS says it prefers diplomatic solution to military takeover in Niger. German national Thomas Scheller jailed in Kenya for 81 years for child sex abuse. Plus, 5 people killed. The South African taxi strike continues. Hello everyone, welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers here in Lagos. Nigeria and West Africa's regional bloc ECOWAS says it will prefer a diplomatic and peaceful resolution to the military takeover in Niger Republic. Speaking to journalists in Abuja, spokesperson for President Bola Tinubu, Ajuri Ngelale, said that the bloc would prefer a resolution that's obtained through diplomacy and peace. He adds that this preference may change depending on future resolutions discussed at the ECOWAS summit on Thursday.
Diplomacy is the best way forward. In representing the consensus position of the ECOWAS heads of state, he has communicated clearly that he, along with his colleagues in the bloc, would prefer a resolution that was obtained through diplomatic means, through peaceful means, rather than any other. And that will be a position that is maintained going forward, pending any other resolution that may or may not result from the ECOWAS Extraordinary Summit holding on Thursday.
Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department says funding for international military education and training, peacekeeping operations, and foreign military financing programs supporting Niger's counterterrorism capabilities are among the assistance the United States has paused after the military takeover in the country. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller told reporters the United States is still hopeful and trying to achieve a return to constitutional order in Niger after the military takeover late last month.
Acting Secretary Nuland met yesterday with leaders of the junta and made clear that there was a diplomatic path forward for them if they would choose a return to constitutional order. She also made clear that there would be consequences if they didn't, that there are hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. assistance at stake. As she said last night in the call she had with the press, they were very difficult conversations. She didn't achieve any breakthroughs, and it's not at all clear that they will choose the diplomatic path forward. And so here are a few examples of the types of assistance that are being paused. Approximately $1 million in international military education and training funding, which sends Nigerian military students to the U.S. For training. Our peacekeeping operations funded programs that support infrastructure, training, advisory support, and equipment for counterterrorism and or peacekeeping purposes. We are still hopeful, and we are still trying to achieve a result that is a return to the constitutional order. We hope we don't have to get to that point where we need to make that determination, because our hope is to see the constitutional order restored. We don't believe that window's closed at this point, but it's a very dynamic situation.
A German national has been sentenced to 81 years in prison after a Kenyan court found him guilty of several counts of child abuse and possession of child pornography. 74-year-old Thomas Scheller was charged in 2020 after it was alleged that he had sexually abused a 13-year-old child and showing 2 other minors child pornography in Kisumu, a Kenyan port city on Lake Victoria. Court documents show that Scheller was arrested outside the German embassy in Nairobi after police investigated him for months. Mr. Scheller told the court that he had been framed and was merely trying to help the child and his mother. However, the court also added his name to the sex offender registry of Kenya. Meanwhile, talks to end political tensions over the rising cost of living and electoral reforms in Kenya are due to resume between the governing Kenya Kwanza and the opposition Azimio la Umoja coalitions. Azimio led deadly protests in March and July against President William Ruto's government to demand the reconstitution of the Electoral Commission and the lowering of the cost of living. The unrest worsened after the government introduced higher taxes and levies in July to raise revenue for President Ruto's first budget. Opposition leader Raila Odinga's team wants to discuss the cost of living and electoral reforms after it lost the elections last year. The government insists it's already working to fix inflation and reduce the cost of basic commodities. Both Mr. Ruto and Mr. Odinga have said that the talks would not lead to any power-sharing deal. In the meantime, Kenyans have condemned a plan to increase national park entry fees beginning from next year. The Nairobi National Park, famed globally as the only national park within the city, is most affected by the proposed increase announced on Tuesday, with fees increasing by almost a factor of 5. The park's entry fees will go up to 2,000 Kenyan shillings, up from the current 430 shillings for Kenyans and East African residents of other African countries, and the rest of the world will pay up to $100 or more, which is more than double the current fee of $43. Visitors to other parks across the country will also pay a higher amount depending on the park category and season, but the increase is lower than that charged to access the park in the capital. Many Kenyans are arguing that the proposed fees are too high, coming amid a rise in the general cost of living. Let's get more on this. Joining me now is Kenyan journalist Cyrus Mbati, who joins me virtually from Nairobi. Good to see you today, Cyrus.
Good evening, good to see you today.
Right, so quite a lot to unpack here. But let's begin with the sentencing of the German national Thomas Scheller. What more can you tell us about this case?
Well, when he was sentenced yesterday, he seemed taken aback by the sentence which was awarded given to him, because he never expected he would be held for that long, more than 70 years in jail now. Since he was arrested and he tried to flee the country, he's been behind the jail, and he was never allowed to leave because the prosecution said he was a flight risk. And this is not the first time such people are being arrested and being detained in Kenya. We have so many foreigners who come here in the name of helping the locals, and then in the end they become now molesters or defilers in the one way or the other. It's a good lesson, or it's a warning to those who are doing the same things here.
And let's shift our attention to the economy now. Now that talks are due to resume to address the rising cost of living in Kenya, what could be the possible outcome of this discussion?
Well, actually, the talks are now beginning. They began today. It was kind of a cut and raise of the talks between the government and the opposition. And the opposition has actually issued a statement saying that theirs will be basically on the cost of living and electoral reforms and other issues that are pressing on Kenyans. And we are not seeing the kind of chest thumping which was on the side of the government previously before the talks began, because today when the talks began, the government side was kind of calm and they welcomed the whole process, because they say they had much respect for the former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, who actually brokered the talks or the deal between the government and the opposition. Many Kenyans have hopes that this will actually usher in a period where we can see the cost of living coming down, because of there's an act which was brought by the government into effect, which has short so much in terms of cost of living high. So we hope, the many Kenyans hope that things will improve in the coming days.
Talking about hope among the residents and the citizens of Kenya, what are their thoughts about this? Are they thinking, is this going to be yet another talk no action kind of meeting? Plus, coming back to you, have you seen any signs of protests resuming across the country?
Well, we started with the protest. Yeah, we would see the protest like yesterday. There were protests in Nairobi, and the police were men in town. They arrested quite a number of people because yesterday was a day of it's called in Ananana, it's 8-8, and then it was August 8th. So the human rights organizations and other active people were joining. They tried to hold a protest in Nairobi. They were suppressed by the police, who chased and arrested some of them. They were taken to court today. We are going to see more protests in the coming days because from the government side, there's a lot of, again, this kind of just stamping. People are not, there's no hope. I can't say there's no hope per se because the talks are ongoing, but we're seeing a situation where some people in government are saying there's nothing to negotiate about the cost of living because they are putting measures to ensure the cost of living goes down. But then we don't see the same because themselves, there's extravagance on the side of the government, the way they operate. So it's an issue of wait and see now. It's just being hopeful that things will be better in the coming days.
And Cyrus, it seems Kenyans are not about to allow anything disturb their fun time, as there have been outrage over the country's plan to increase the national park entry fees. How bad is the economy right now that the Nairobi National Park fee has to go up, and what's the reason for this?
It's outrageous, as you can put it, because as much as the Kenya Wildlife Service is saying these are just a proposal seeking for public views to give in the comments on whether they should increase or not, but then it's outrageous to say that much to say about that, because the agents that run the parks themselves, they are not improving anything. They have not improved the kind of services they offer at the parks. And they're coming at a time when the economy is so bad, battling the Kenyans. It's unfortunate that they can make such a proposal at a time when everyone is suffering economically. The cost of living has gone high, the cost of fuel is going high. So it was a bad timing to say, per se. For 2020, but it's when it was put on hold because then there was also an outrage from the government and from the Kenyans for that. Now again, today when this thing came out again, there was a much more outrage. So we believe we've talked to a number of enthusiasts who are going to visit the national parks, saying they are going to oppose them to the end. So we don't see them passing through.
And how are tourists and visitors alike reacting to this?
I mean, for the tourists, they may not know us now because this is a proposal which is put across for Kenyans to give their views. But then if and when they become effective, that's when we will see the effects or the impact of the same, because they will be shocked to find the cost of assessing these national parks is going behind. This automatically is going to send away many tourists who come here in Kenya, because it's expensive to say. It's very expensive. They can't afford most of them. Even if it's Kenyans, even with international tourists from like Nigerians come to Kenya. So when you add such kind of amount of money for them to access the national parks, it's outrageous to say.
Right, Cyrus, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Let's move elsewhere now. Liberian authorities have arrested and handed over a former Sierra Leonean police chief accused by his own country of planning a coup against President Julius Bio's government. Liberian Information Minister Ledgerhood Rennie said in a statement that Mohamed Toure was arrested at the request of the Sierra Leonean authorities on the allegation of helping plan subversive activities intended to unseat Mr. Bio's government. He said Liberia had decided to hand the ex-police chief over to Sierra Leone as requested following preliminary investigations. He added that Sierra Leone had given assurances that his rights would be respected, including the right to a fair and speedy trial. However, Liberia's Independent National Commission on Human Rights cautioned against the extradition, citing the risk of surrendered persons facing physical abuse, unfair trial, or excessive punishment by the requesting government. Welcome back. Over in Ghana, where the country's main opposition party has given a 3-week ultimatum to the central bank governor and his deputy to resign, the National Democratic Congress accuses Ernest Addison of recklessness and mismanaging the bank, with the bank accused of illegally printing money and spending over $8.6 million on travel expenses. A recent annual report of the central bank indicated it recorded about $5.4 billion in losses last year. However, the bank has denied the NDC allegations and attributed the losses to a domestic debt restructuring deal that was part of the conditions for securing a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. We're now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where at least 3 people have been killed in presumed attacks by members of the Codeco armed group. UN spokesperson Farhan Haq notes that 3 others were injured in that incident, which took place in the southeast of Djougou in the Ituri province.
Our peacekeeping colleagues in the Democratic Republic of the Congo are telling us that yesterday they responded to a presumed attack by members of the Codeco armed group. This attack took place in Largu, which is southeast of Djougou in Ituri province, and resulted in the deaths of 3 people with 3 others injured. As soon as the alert was raised, the UN mission, MONUSCO, and the Congolese armed forces deployed a joint patrol to the village, forcing the attackers to withdraw. As the incident unfolded, many civilians fled from the nearby Drodro displacement camp and sought sanctuary at the MONUSCO base. Peacekeepers and national forces provided protection for approximately 1,000 civilians at the internally displaced persons camp overnight and are continuing to patrol the area to deter further attacks and enable displaced families to return safely to the site.
Now to the crisis in Sudan. At least 20 civilians have died in the latest clashes between the Sudanese army and the rapid response forces in Sudan's greater capital area. The area made up of Khartoum, Khartoum North and Omdurman has been plagued by violence since mid-April between the warring sides, with the fighting in Omdurman further intensifying on Tuesday. The RSF, which has besieged the Sudanese army's engineering headquarters for several days, launched attacks with heavy artillery, tanks and other heavy weapons. The Sudanese army sent reinforcements to break out of the RSF encirclement in the north of Omdurman and carried out large-scale airstrikes against hostile targets. The Sudanese army claimed its operation in Omdurman resulted in hundreds of RSF casualties, while the RSF said over 100 Sudanese soldiers were killed and over 300 others wounded. The UN Refugee Agency is warning that health conditions in Sudan is rapidly deteriorating due to the forcible displacement of over 4 million people. Refugee camps, as well as border entry points and transit centers in neighboring countries, are set to be experiencing worsening conditions due to the arrival of people who have had to flee. According to UNHCR spokesman William Spindler, over 144,000 newly displaced refugees from Khartoum arrived in all 10 refugee camps in White Nile State since the conflict began.
With more than 4 million people now forcibly displaced by the Sudan crisis, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is deeply worried about deteriorating health conditions across the country, including in refugee camps as well as at border entry points and transit centers in neighboring countries where people forced to flee are arriving. The situation inside Sudan, where UNHCR teams are present, is untenable, as the needs far outweigh what is humanly possible to deliver with the available resources. In White Nile State, a lack of essential medicines, staff and supplies is severely hampering health and nutrition services in all 10 refugee camps, where over 144,000 newly displaced refugees from Khartoum have arrived since the conflict started. As many families have been on the move for weeks with very little food and medicine, rising malnutrition rates, disease outbreaks and related deaths continue to be observed. In addition, severe cholera and malaria are expected in the coming months due to flooding from the continuing rains and inadequate sanitation facilities.
To legal matters, top jurists from across the African continent converged at the University of South Africa, UNISA, in Pretoria. for the 2023 Annual African Bar Association Conference. The event focused on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Topics included global geopolitics and African alignments, contemporary issues affecting the legal profession in Africa, and the African lawyer under AFCFTA, to name a few. The conference was graced by notable personalities, including Honorable Chief Justice of the Republic of South Africa, Raymond Zondo, and Chief Justice of the Republic of Sierra Leone, Justice Desmond Edwards. Our South Africa correspondent, Innocent Semosa, reports.
The discourse here is centered around building the legal profession in Africa under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The conference was hosted by the African Bar Association, AFBA, in partnership with the University of South Africa, UNISA. The Vice-Chancellor of UNISA, Professor Buleng Likambula, advocates for strong institutions in order to address contemporary issues affecting the legal profession in Africa.
It is an opportunity for us to collectively address the importance of transparency in governance, in security, the rule of law, and in shaping Africa's futures. But the question, colleagues, are we creating lawyers or legal practitioners that are committed to advancing Africa's knowledge systems?
We shouldn't come here and make rhetorics and go back home with nothing to write about. A lot has been said about the legal and the intellectual scope, but you permit me look at the political domain, that whatever we will say here, it would only be speeches. If we remain blocked by the barriers called national boundaries, where if we want to leave one African country to a neighboring country, we are subjected to visa conditions which takes us 2 weeks or so.
The Chief Justice of South Africa, Raymond Zondo, cites the role of the judiciary in achieving the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
There is no specific provision provided for the role and place of the courts. The courts, nevertheless, will deal with certain types of disputes.
While we've had many conferences in attempt to realize after, implementation remains an issue, raising doubts about whether these conversations will result in any actual measures or answers. I chatted with some delegates here, and this is what they said.
I think we have a long way to go in that. Our legal education historically has been paneled after the European nations, whether it is the common law system, whether it is the civil law system. And the colonial influences are still very much there. So we need to begin to look at our university curriculum and say, look, if you want to train a lawyer, yes, it's important to have a universal knowledge of law in accordance with common law systems and all that. But how do we import into those training systems the essentials that are rudimentary for countries in Africa? How do we make an African lawyer truly African, be able to hold his own with pride?
But right now, I think that with the level of collaboration globally, looking at Europe, looking at America and the rest of them, how they collaborate effectively, Africa has risen, Africa has woken up. This is the time for us to embrace the future of Africa globally and establish this trend. And that is why the African Bar Association is keen into this, so that lawyers who have capacity to have some of these things enforced will put their voices on it.
Throughout the event, prominent figures and key speakers engaged in discussions to advance the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The first day, the conference was rounded off by the presentation from the University of South Africa Choir. From Pretoria, South Africa, Innocent Semosa, Channels Television News.
Well, 5 people, including a 40-year-old British national and a police officer, have died in violent protests related to the taxi strike in Cape Town, South Africa. This comes after a week-long strike was called by the South African National Taxi Council. The strike was in response to what the drivers called heavy-handed tactics by law enforcement authorities. The UK issued a South Africa travel warning after the strike was listed as a high-security threat. The taxi strike is expected to continue after negotiations broke down between Santaco and the provincial government led by the Democratic Alliance. And that's Network Africa. Thank you for watching. I'm Joker Rogers.